June 18th, 1944, 1447 hours. Normandy hedgerows. The 80 mm shell hit M4 Sherman tank, Kansas Belle, on the left side, sponsored with a sound like God slamming a steel door, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb watched from 50 yards away as 5 men he'd eaten breakfast with that morning started dying in ways that would give him nightmares for the next 45 years. The German round, fired from a camouflaged Jagd Panther tank destroyer, concealed 600 yards northeast in the hedgerow maze that turned Normandy into a green hell of killing positions, punched through 2 inches of rolled homogeneous armor at 2,700 feet per second, traveled through the crew compartment in a fraction of a second, and exited through the right side hull after shredding the pressurized aluminum fuel line that ran 14 inches behind the driver's seat. Gasoline erupted inside the tank under 8 pounds per square inch of pressure. The fuel line split along a 6-inch seam and sprayed 87-octane gasoline across the engine compartment, where surface temperatures routinely hit 400 degrees Fahrenheit during operation. The gasoline ignited instantly, and what happened next took exactly 8 seconds from penetration to crew death. Webb had eaten breakfast with those 5 men 3 hours ago. Corporal Eddie Martinez, the gunner, 24 years old from San Antonio, had been showing everyone photographs of his newborn daughter Rosa, born 3 weeks earlier, a little girl he'd never met. Mother wrote that she had Eddie's eyes and his smile and couldn't wait for him to come home. Private Billy Thompson, the loader, 19 years old from Akron, had been complaining about the powdered eggs, saying his mom made scrambled eggs with cheese and he'd give anything for real food instead of this reconstituted yellow powder that tasted like cardboard. Sergeant Dave Kowalski, the tank commander, 28 years old from Detroit, same city as Webb. They'd talked about Tiger Stadium and the Red Wings and promised to get beers together when the war ended, had been quiet that morning, writing a letter to his wife Ellen that he'd said he'd finish later, except there wouldn't be a later. Corporal Jim Riley, the assistant driver, 22 years old from Savannah, had been singing while they loaded ammunition. Some gospel hymn his grandmother taught him, Amazing Grace, in a surprisingly good tenor voice that echoed off the Norman hedgerows. And Private First Class Tommy Richardson, the driver, 23 years old from Hutchinson, Kansas, had been talking about his wife Sarah and their 120-acre farm, and how he couldn't wait to get back to planting wheat because anything was better than sitting in a steel coffin waiting for Germans to kill him. All 5 of them were burning now. Webb saw the flash first, orange light visible through the driver's vision port for a fraction of a second, like someone striking a match inside the tank. Then smoke, black, oily smoke that poured from every opening in the hull with the kind of volume that suggested massive combustion happening inside a sealed space. Then he heard the screaming. 5 voices initially, all shouting at once, words that might have been fire, or help, or God, turning into sounds that weren't words anymore, just noise, raw animal panic vocalized by men who knew they were burning alive and had maybe 10 seconds to get out before smoke or flames killed them. The driver's hatch flew open. Tommy Richardson appeared, climbing out, moving fast, his hands grabbing the hatch rim and pulling himself up. His coveralls were already burning. Not smoldering, burning. Flames visible on his back and shoulders where gasoline had splashed during the initial fuel spray. His face was blackened by smoke except for his eyes, which were wide and white and filled with the kind of naked terror that comes from feeling your skin catch fire and knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. He screamed. Not words, just sound. High-pitched and continuous. The sound humans make when pain exceeds the brain's ability to process it into language. He made it halfway out, waist level. His hands gripped the hatch rim, pulling, straining, trying to drag himself through. His fingers were smoking. The friction-resistant leather gloves he'd been wearing had already burned away, and the skin on his palms was blistering, peeling, exposing raw red flesh underneath. He pulled harder, his legs kicking inside the tank, trying to find purchase against something. Anything. 10 more seconds, and he'd be out. 10 more seconds, and he'd be rolling in the grass, extinguishing the flames, surviving with burns that would hurt like hell, but wouldn't kill him. Then the flames inside Kansas Belle reached the ammunition storage, 32 rounds of 75mm high explosives stored in racks along both hull sides, plus 300 rounds of 30 caliber machine gun ammunition stored in boxes near the gunner's position. The first 75mm round cooked off at 1,448 hours and 14 seconds. The brass casing ruptured from internal pressure before the primer could ignite properly, spraying molten brass and unburned propellant across the interior. The propellant ignited in midair, creating a secondary flash that raised the interior temperature another 200 degrees in half a second. The second round detonated properly, the high explosive warhead exploding with full force inside the crew compartment. Then the third. Then all 32 remaining rounds in a cascading chain reaction that took 1.3 seconds from first detonation to complete destruction. Kansas Belle exploded from the inside out. The detonation blew the 7-ton turret straight up, with enough force to flip it completely upside down before it crashed back onto the burning hull, with a sound like a car wreck happening underwater. The side armor plates bulged outward, welds failing, seams splitting. The engine deck blew off and tumbled end over end 30 feet across the Norman grass. And Tommy Richardson, who'd been halfway out the hatch, 10 seconds from survival, was simply gone. Not dead, not fallen, gone. Vaporized by the blast wave into component atoms, flesh and bone converted to pink mist and carbon and fragments too small to identify. Where he'd been there was nothing except empty air and smoke and a fine spray of blood that settled across 20 feet of hedgerow like crimson rain. The driver's hatch, which his hands had been gripping, was blown clean off its hinges and embedded in a tree trunk 40 feet away. His dog tags, stamped steel rectangles that were supposed to survive anything, were later found 60 feet from the tank, melted together into a lump of slag. Webb stood frozen, his legs refusing to move, his brain refusing to process what his eyes had just witnessed. This wasn't combat. This was execution. This was 5 men cremated alive inside a steel box that was supposed to protect them. Kansas Belle wasn't burning now. She was consuming herself. 33 tons of armor and ammunition and fuel and crew all combusting together in a fire hot enough that Webb could feel it from 50 yards away. Radiant heat that made his skin feel tight and his lungs feel scorched when he breathed. The temperature at the fire's core was probably 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to reduce bone to ash, hot enough that recovery crews would have to wait 4 hours before they could approach the wreckage, and even then, they'd need heat-resistant gloves. The smell hit him next. Burning rubber from the road wheels and track blocks. Burning oil from the transmission and final drives. Burning gasoline from the ruptured fuel tanks. And underneath it all, unmistakable and impossible to ignore, the sweet, sick, wrong smell of cooking meat. Except it wasn't meat. It was men. It was Eddie Martinez who'd shown everyone photos of his daughter Rosa. It was Billy Thompson who'd complained about powdered eggs. It was Dave Kowalski who'd been writing to his wife. It was Jim Riley who'd been singing Amazing Grace. And it was Tommy Richardson who'd almost made it out, who'd been 10 seconds from survival, whose wife Sarah would get a telegram in a week saying he'd been killed in action and whose body couldn't be recovered for burial because there wasn't enough left to fill a shoebox. Webb's stomach lurched. He bent over and vomited into the Norman grass, his body rejecting what his mind was trying to process. He'd grown up in Detroit, working slaughterhouses as a teenager, had seen cattle killed and butchered by the hundreds, thought he had a strong stomach. This was different. This was personal. He'd eaten breakfast with those men. He'd known their names, their hometowns, their wives' names. And now they were smoke and ash, and the smell that would cling to his uniform for 3 days, no matter how many times he washed it. Private Eddie Kowalski, no relation to the Dave Kowalski who'd just died in Kansas Bell, though they joked about being cousins, stood next to Webb, his face pale, his hands shaking. "That's the fourth one today," he said, his voice flat and mechanical, the tone people use when they're trying not to feel anything, because feeling would break them. Fourth Sherman this week that burned after one hit. Fourth crew that didn't make it out. He turned to look at Webb, and his eyes were wet. "Thought these things were supposed to be survivable, Sarge. Thought the armor was supposed to keep us safe. That's what they told us in training." Webb didn't answer, because there was no good answer. The M4 Sherman had a reputation among American tank crews that ranged from adequate to death trap, depending on who you asked and how many tank battles they'd survived. The British called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company, because Sherman tanks lit first time, every time. The Germans called it der Tommy Kocher, the Tommy Cooker, because British and American tankers died inside them when they burned, cooked alive inside steel ovens. The statistics were brutal and getting worse. In the 6 weeks since D-Day, June 6th to July 18th, the U.S. 3rd Armored Division had lost 127 Sherman tanks to German fire. 89 of those had burned so intensely that recovery crews couldn't identify the remains inside except by counting teeth for dental records. Tank crews in Normandy were dying at rates that exceeded infantry casualties in some units. 18% casualty rate for tank crews versus 12% for infantry, despite the fact that tanks were supposed to provide protection. And everyone knew what the problem was: the fuel system. Pressurized aluminum fuel lines positioned 14 inches from the hull side in the hottest part of the tank. Any penetrating hit in that area ruptured the line, sprayed gasoline across the engine, and turned 33 tons of armor into a crematorium in less than 10 seconds. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb was 28 years old, Detroit native, former welder at the Ford River Rouge plant before the draft board decided his skills would be more useful in Europe than on the assembly line. He'd been welding since age 16, started as an apprentice making 40 cents an hour, worked his way up to master welder, making $1.20 an hour before the war. He could weld cast iron to steel, aluminum to copper, could fabricate parts from raw stock without blueprints, could look at a broken assembly and know exactly where to cut and exactly where to reinforce. The Army had assigned him to the 743rd Tank Battalion's maintenance company because they needed welders who could repair battle damage in the field, who could keep tanks running when supply lines from England couldn't keep up with combat losses. Webb had been in Normandy for 12 days. He'd already seen 23 Sherman tanks burn. He'd helped recovery crews extract bodies from 14 of those. Bodies that weren't really bodies anymore. Just charred remains that had to be scraped off surfaces with shovels and collected in bags because there wasn't enough left to put in coffins. But something about watching Tommy Richardson die halfway out of that hatch, 10 seconds from survival, made something snap inside Webb's mind. Richardson had almost made it. The hatch was open. His hands were on the rim. His legs were kicking, trying to climb out. If the ammunition hadn't cooked off, if the explosion had been delayed by just 10 more seconds, Richardson would be standing here right now, with burns that would heal instead of being atomized into mist. The difference between life and death was 10 seconds, and the fact that gasoline inside the tank had ignited when the fuel line ruptured. 10 seconds that could have been prevented if someone figured out how to keep the fuel line from rupturing, or how to position it away from areas where German rounds were most likely to hit. Webb had been thinking about this problem since June 9th, 3 days after D-Day. That was the day he'd helped recover the crew from a burned-out Sherman named Thunderbird III. The driver had been fused to his seat by heat intense enough to melt the steel control levers he'd been gripping. The metal had liquefied, dripped, re-solidified with his hands inside it. The gunner and loader had died trying to escape through the turret hatch, their bodies piled on top of each other in a way that suggested they'd been fighting over who got out first when the smoke suffocated them. Carbon monoxide poisoning, the medical officer said. Quick and painless, he said. Webb didn't believe him because their faces told a different story. Mouths open, expressions frozen in silent screams. The commander and assistant driver had actually escaped, climbed out of the burning tank, rolled in the grass to extinguish the flames on their uniforms. They'd survived for 6 hours, long enough to reach the medical tent, long enough to tell the doctors they couldn't feel their legs, couldn't breathe right, couldn't stop shaking. Then they died from burns covering 70% of their bodies, third-degree burns that had cooked through skin and muscle and fat, leaving nothing but blackened tissue that couldn't heal. Webb had been there when they died, had watched the morphine stop working, watched them start screaming again, watched the medical officer give them enough morphine to kill them because leaving them alive would have been crueler. That night, Webb couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop seeing the driver's hands melted inside the control levers, couldn't stop smelling the sweet, sick smell of burned flesh that clung to his clothes and his hair and his skin, no matter how many times he washed. He'd lain in his tent, staring at the canvas ceiling and thinking about fuel lines and fuel pressures and heat transfer and combustion temperatures. He'd done the mathematics in his head. 8 pounds per square inch fuel pressure times half-inch diameter fuel line equals approximately 2 gallons per minute flow rate. Aluminum tubing with 1/16 inch wall thickness fails at approximately 400 pounds per square inch of external pressure, which meant any armor-piercing round passing within 2 inches of the fuel line would rupture it from shock wave alone, even if it didn't directly hit the line. Engine compartment temperatures during operation: 350 to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on load. Gasoline auto-ignition temperature: 495 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the presence of sparks or open flame, it ignites at any temperature. Conclusion: the fuel system was a death trap, and every Sherman in Normandy was carrying a bomb waiting to explode. Webb walked toward Kansas Belle, ignoring Kowalski's shout of, "Sergeant, that thing could cook off again." The tank was burning itself out now, the initial fury of the gasoline explosion settling into the slower burn of everything else that could combust. Rubber seals, electrical insulation, canvas equipment covers, the leather padding on the crew seats. The heat was still intense, but manageable if you didn't get closer than 30 feet. Webb circled around to the left side where the 88mm round had penetrated. The entry hole was a ragged circle 3.5 inches in diameter, surrounded by petalled steel where the armor had failed. The round had hit exactly where the fuel line ran behind the driver's position, 14 inches from the outer hull, right in the kill zone. Not luck. Physics. The fuel line was positioned in the only clear path from the rear fuel tanks to the front engine compartment that didn't interfere with the turret basket or the transmission or the ammunition storage. And that path ran directly through the most vulnerable part of the tank, the section of hull that German gunners aimed for, because they knew American side armor was only 2 inches thick compared to 3 inches frontal. The problem was obvious to anyone who'd spent time working on internal combustion engines. The fuel line was positioned in the worst possible location, close to the hull side where armor was thinnest, running through the hottest part of the tank directly behind the engine compartment, and routed at exactly the height where most penetrating rounds would hit it. Any hit in that area had a near 100% chance of rupturing the fuel line, igniting the gasoline, and killing the crew in less than 10 seconds. And in Normandy's hedgerow country, where German tanks and anti-tank guns ambushed from concealed positions at ranges of 200 to 800 yards, most combat damage occurred on the hull sides. The statistics proved it. 89 of the 127 destroyed Shermans had burned after side hull penetrations. Only 16 had burned from frontal hits. The remaining 22 had been mobility kills or mission kills that didn't burn because the rounds hadn't hit the fuel system. Webb had been thinking about solutions for 9 days. He'd thought about it while welding damaged drive sprockets back onto tanks that limped back from the front lines with thrown tracks and bent wheels. He'd thought about it while fabricating replacement parts from salvaged German equipment because American supply depots were 6 weeks behind on spare parts requisitions. He'd thought about it while eating meals that tasted like cardboard because he couldn't stop smelling burned flesh. He'd thought about it at night, lying in his tent, listening to artillery fire in the distance, and calculating weights and pressures and heat coefficients and failure stresses in his head. And watching Kansas Belle burn, with Tommy Richardson halfway out the hatch, crystallized everything into one simple realization. The fuel line needed to be moved. Not redesigned by engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground, who would take 6 months to build prototypes and another 6 months to test them. Not approved by ordnance committees, who would debate the change for 3 months and form subcommittees to study the cost implications and the manufacturing impacts and the supply chain modifications. Rerouted now, in the field, using materials Webb could scavenge and tools he already had. The physics were simple. The execution would be hard. But Webb had spent 6 years on Ford assembly lines where hard meant requires overtime and swearing, not impossible. The solution was clear in his mind. Move the fuel line from its current position, 14 inches from the hull side, running through the engine heat zone, to a new position along the floor, where 3 factors would improve survivability. First, floor positioning. Put the line 2 feet below the trajectory of most penetrating rounds, which meant rounds that currently hit the fuel line would pass over it instead. Second, floor temperatures stayed cooler, typically 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to 400 plus degrees near the engine, which meant less thermal stress on the tubing and lower risk of auto-ignition if gasoline leaked. Third, floor mounting allowed installation of steel protective brackets that would act as additional armor, deflecting fragments and absorbing impact energy before it reached the fuel line itself. The modification required 3 components: copper tubing to replace the aluminum line, steel brackets to protect and support the new routing, and bolts to mount everything. Total cost per tank, approximately $2.40 in materials. Total installation time, approximately 6 hours with a 2-man crew. Total potential lives saved, incalculable. He walked back to his maintenance truck, an M34 2.5-ton cargo vehicle that served as mobile workshop, parts depot, and occasionally sleeping quarters when there wasn't time to return to base camp. The truck bed was loaded with welding equipment, an acetylene torch setup with 40-pound gas cylinders, an arc welder powered by a small gasoline generator, cutting torches, grinding wheels, and enough hand tools to equip 3 mechanics. Most of the equipment was official Army issue. Some of it Webb had requisitioned from abandoned German positions because official supply channels moved at approximately 1/10 the speed that tanks were being destroyed. And if you waited for proper paperwork, 3 more Shermans would burn while the forms were being processed. Private Kowalski followed him, still pale but recovering. "Sarge, what are you thinking?" Webb grabbed a pad of paper and a pencil from his toolkit. Standard issue Army pencil, wood shaft with dull graphite that required sharpening every 10 minutes. "I'm thinking that aluminum fuel lines positioned 14 inches from the hull side in the hottest part of the tank are killing more Americans than German 80mm rounds are." He started sketching, his hand moving automatically, drawing the interior layout of an M4 Sherman from memory. He'd been inside enough of them, working on enough of them, recovering bodies from enough of them, that he could draw the interior with his eyes closed. Driver's position on the left front, assistant driver position on the right front, transmission bulge in the center, turret basket in the middle, engine compartment in the rear, fuel tanks at the very rear, ammunition storage racks along both hull sides, and running from the fuel tanks to the engine, positioned 14 inches from the left hull side, the aluminum fuel line that killed more tank crews than enemy fire. He drew modifications over the original layout, new routing along the floor, from the fuel tanks, along the right side, where there was slightly more space, forward to the engine. Every 12 inches, a steel bracket bolted to the floor, clamping the fuel line in place, providing structural support and impact protection. Where the line needed to rise from the floor to connect with the engine feed, a reinforced section with double brackets and extra shielding. He added dimensions, specifications, notes about materials. The sketch took 4 minutes. The idea had been forming in his head for 9 days. Putting it on paper just made it official. He looked up at Kowalski. "How many destroyed Shermans do we have in the salvage yard?" "Probably 25, Kowalski said. "Most of them burned out or took penetrating hits through the turret." "Why, Sarge?" "Because I need copper tubing, and the Army doesn't issue copper tubing for fuel systems, but German armored vehicles use copper hydraulic lines that are almost the right diameter and pressure rating." Webb folded his sketch and shoved it in his breast pocket. "I also need 8-cent bolts, washers, brackets, clamps, and about 6 hours to figure out if this idea is going to save lives or get me court-martialed." He climbed into the maintenance truck and started the engine. "Get in. We're going shopping in the graveyard." The salvage yard was located 2 miles behind the front lines in what had been a French farmer's cow pasture before D-Day. Now, it was the 743rd Tank Battalion's repository for everything too damaged to repair but too valuable to abandon. 23 Sherman tanks in various states of destruction, 14 half-tracks, 8 M10 tank destroyers, assorted trucks and jeeps, and 1 German Panther tank that had been captured intact after its crew abandoned it when the transmission failed. The Panther sat in the far corner of the yard, 45 tons of advanced German engineering rendered useless by a broken gear that would have taken 20 minutes to replace if the crew had known how to do field repairs. Instead, they'd bailed out and run, and now American ordnance teams were studying it to figure out how to kill more of them. Webb parked the maintenance truck and walked through the salvage yard, looking at each destroyed Sherman, categorizing damage, mentally inventorying salvageable parts. The yard smelled like death and diesel and burned metal and things that shouldn't burn but had. 12 Shermans had burned completely. Interiors carbonized, hulls heat-warped, nothing salvageable except maybe the final drives and road wheels. 7 had been mission-killed by mechanical failure, thrown tracks, broken transmissions, still mostly intact, potentially repairable if parts arrived. 4 had taken penetrating hits, but hadn't burned. Those were the ones Webb needed. But first, he walked past Sherman number 4, Thunder Road, burned so completely the interior was just charcoal and slag. The driver's hatch was still open. He'd almost made it out. Almost. Webb could see what was left of him. Carbonized bone fused to the hatch rim, melted dog tags, the outline of a human shape permanently impressed into the metal like a photograph developed in fire. He didn't look directly at it. Couldn't. Looking would mean acknowledging that the shape used to be human, used to have a name, used to have a family waiting for him to come home. Sherman number 7, Belle of Richmond, had taken an 80mm round through the turret. The commander and gunner had died instantly from the penetrating round itself, not from fire. Trauma so severe their bodies hadn't bled because there wasn't time for blood pressure to register what had happened before the heart stopped. The loader and driver had died from smoke inhalation, suffocated by combustion gases before the flames reached them. Webb could see their shapes in the crew compartment, hunched positions that suggested they'd been trying to get the hatches open when they lost consciousness. Carbon monoxide poisoning, probably. The medical officer said it was quick, painless, like going to sleep. Webb didn't believe him because their faces, even burned, showed expressions that didn't look peaceful. Sherman number 11, Iron Horse, had burned after a fuel line rupture identical to Kansas Bell's. Same German gun, same type of penetrating round, same location of impact. The crew had actually escaped this one. All 5 got out, rolled in the grass to extinguish the flames on their uniforms, called for medics. 3 died anyway. Burns covering 80% of their bodies, third-degree burns that cooked through skin and muscle, leaving exposed tissue that couldn't heal. Webb had helped carry one of them to the medical tent. The man, Private Daniels from Minnesota, 20 years old, had been conscious, screaming, begging for morphine, begging to die. The medics gave him both. First morphine in doses that should have rendered him unconscious. When that didn't work, more morphine. When he kept screaming, enough morphine to stop his heart. He died 4 hours after the fire, still screaming, still conscious until the very end. Webb had stood there holding Daniels' hand because there was nothing else to do. And when Daniels finally stopped breathing, Webb had walked outside and vomited and punched a tree until his knuckles bled, because rage was the only emotion he could process that didn't involve breaking down completely. He found what he needed on Sherman number 16, Lucky Strike, which had taken an 80mm round through the turret but hadn't burned. The round killed the commander and gunner instantly, but the hull and engine compartment were intact, fuel system undamaged. Webb crawled underneath with a bucket to catch gasoline and a wrench to disconnect the fuel line. He opened the drain valve on the fuel tank and waited while 40 gallons of 87 octane drained into the bucket. Then he cut the aluminum fuel line at both ends, 40 feet of half-inch aluminum tubing, factory manufactured somewhere in America and shipped to Normandy to carry gasoline through a tank that was designed to fight Germans, but not to avoid burning when hit. The aluminum was surprisingly light. The entire 40-foot section weighed maybe 6 pounds. Light meant cheap to manufacture and easy to install. It also meant fragile, prone to rupture from impact shock, even when the impacting object didn't directly strike it. The copper came from the captured German Panther in the corner. Webb approached it carefully. German vehicles sometimes had booby traps, anti-handling devices designed to kill scavengers. This one was clean. American ordnance teams had already swept it. The Panther's turret traverse system used copper hydraulic lines, 3/4-inch diameter, heavy wall tubing designed to handle 2,000 pounds per square inch of pressure without rupturing. Webb cut free 20 feet of it using bolt cutters, the copper resisting the blades until he put his full weight on the handles. The tubing was heavier than the aluminum, probably 20 pounds for 20 feet, but also much stronger. Copper didn't shatter under impact. It deformed, bent, absorbed energy, but it didn't rupture as easily as aluminum. And the larger diameter meant better flow characteristics, less restriction, lower pressure drop from tank to engine. The steel brackets came from destroyed half-tracks, L-shaped pieces of 16-gauge steel, 3 inches long, pre-drilled with mounting holes. Webb cut 30 of them using an acetylene torch, the blue flame slicing through steel like butter, throwing sparks that landed on his coveralls and burned small holes before he could brush them away. Each bracket took 90 seconds to cut. Total time for 30 brackets, 45 minutes. The mounting bolts were harder to source. American supply depots were chronically short of hardware smaller than half-inch diameter because someone in logistics had calculated that tanks needed big bolts for tracks and road wheels, and nobody anticipated needing small bolts for field modifications. Webb found what he needed by cannibalizing destroyed German equipment. Steel bolts, 8 mm diameter, 40 mm long, with hex heads and lock washers. Cost and raw materials, approximately 8 cents per bolt. Webb needed 60 bolts per tank, 2 per bracket, 30 brackets per modification. Total hardware cost, $4.80 per Sherman. Add in the copper tubing and brackets and miscellaneous fittings. Total modification cost per tank came to approximately $2.40 in salvaged materials and maybe $8 in labor if you counted Webb's time at Army Sergeant pay rate. By 1800 hours, Webb had everything he needed to modify one tank as proof of concept. He'd sketched the installation procedure, calculated the measurements, gathered the materials. Now, he needed permission to actually do it, because modifying military equipment without authorization was technically a court-martial offense, and technically, Webb was about to violate approximately 6 different Army regulations regarding field modifications to standardized equipment. Captain Raymond Miller found Webb in the salvage yard, carrying an armload of copper tubing. Miller was 34 years old, West Point class of 1932, career officer who'd been commanding tank maintenance units since 1940. He'd served in North Africa with Patton, seen combat at Kasserine Pass, where American forces learned the hard way that German tanks were better than anything the US had. He'd seen enough burned-out Shermans, written enough letters to grieving families, signed enough death certificates that he'd stopped believing in perfect solutions and started believing in anything that might save even one life. He stood watching Webb work for 3 minutes before speaking. "Sergeant Webb, what exactly are you doing with that copper tubing?" Webb set down his armload and turned to face his commanding officer. He could read the situation. Miller either thought he was crazy or was willing to listen. The trick was figuring out which before saying something that would get him sent to the stockade. "Fixing the Sherman's fuel line problem, sir. Rerouting it away from the kill zone so penetrating rounds don't rupture it and burn the crew alive." He pulled out his sketch and showed Miller the modifications. Current aluminum line runs 14 inches from the hull side right behind the driver in the hottest part of the tank. Any penetration in that section ruptures the line, ignites the gasoline, crew dies in 8 seconds. My modification routes copper tubing along the floor, bracketed every 12 inches with steel supports. Copper doesn't rupture as easily as aluminum. Better impact resistance. Floor stays cooler than the engine compartment. Lower thermal stress and auto-ignition risk. Steel brackets provide additional protection. Act like secondary armor. Physics says it should work. I want to test it on one tank. Verify the concept, then scale it if successful. Miller studied the sketch in silence. He was good at math. West Point taught engineering before it taught tactics, and he could see immediately what Webb was proposing. The current fuel line was positioned in the worst possible location from a survivability perspective. Webb's modification moved it to a better location using materials that were readily available and techniques that didn't require specialized training. The question wasn't whether it would work. The question was whether it would work well enough to justify the time and resources and risk of modifying combat vehicles in the field without engineering approval. How long does the modification take? 6 hours per tank with a 2-man crew, Webb said. 4 hours if we get efficient at it. I need to test it first, make sure the routing works, verify the connections don't leak, confirm the engine gets adequate fuel flow at all throttle positions. But if it works, I can modify every operational Sherman in the battalion in about a week, maybe 8 days, accounting for combat operations and maintenance schedules. Miller looked at Webb for a long moment. He'd signed 89 letters to families in the past 6 weeks. 89 letters explaining that their sons, or husbands, or brothers had died in tank fires, and the remains couldn't be recovered for burial because they were too badly burned to identify. He was tired of signing letters. He was tired of watching Shermans burn. He was tired of hearing crews scream over the radio while they cooked alive inside tanks that were supposed to protect them. If there was even a chance that an 8-cent bolt modification created by a welder from Detroit could save lives, he was willing to take that chance. Permission granted. Test it on one tank. If it works, you'll have whatever resources you need. Welders, materials, time, personnel. If it doesn't work and kills someone, I'm putting you up for court-martial for unauthorized modifications to military equipment. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. And Sergeant? Miller's expression softened slightly. If this works, I'm recommending you for a Silver Star. We've lost too many good men to fires that shouldn't happen. If you can stop even one Sherman from burning, it's worth it. Webb worked through the night of June 18th, installing his modification on an M4 Sherman that had been returned from combat with minor track damage, but was otherwise fully operational. Tank, Iron Duke, serial number 354824, assigned to Baker Company, 743rd Tank Battalion, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant James Holloway. Holloway was 24 years old, 3rd Tank Commander assignment after the first 2 died in combat. Lieutenant Morrison burned in his tank during the advance on Carentan. Lieutenant Peters killed by German anti-tank gun near St. Lo. Holloway had heard about Webb's modification from someone who'd seen him working in the salvage yard, and he'd immediately volunteered Iron Duke as the test vehicle. He'd lost 8 crew members in the past 2 weeks to tank fires. 8 men he'd trained with, eaten with, shared cigarettes with. 2 had burned in their tanks. 3 had escaped, but died from burns. 3 had survived with injuries that meant they'd never fully use their hands again. Holloway was willing to try anything that might improve his crew's chances of survival, even an untested field modification created by a maintenance welder. Webb crawled inside Iron Duke at 2100 hours with his tools, his copper tubing, his steel brackets, his bucket of 8-cent bolts. The interior of a Sherman tank was cramped even when it wasn't being used for combat. 6 feet from floor to ceiling in the crew compartment, maybe 8 feet of usable width between the ammunition racks, packed with equipment and controls and systems that left barely enough room for 5 men to operate effectively. Working inside it required contortions that made Webb's back scream within the first hour. He disconnected the aluminum fuel line at both ends, cutting it free from the mounting clips that held it 14 inches behind the driver's position. The line came free easily. It had never been designed for durability, just for function. He coiled it carefully and set it aside. 40 feet of aluminum tubing that had been a death trap. He'd save it, maybe melt it down, turn it into something that wouldn't kill Americans. Then he started routing the copper tubing along the floor, following the path he'd sketched on paper. From the fuel tanks in the rear, along the right side of the whole floor, where the surface stayed relatively cool because it was further from the engine compartment, forward toward the transmission bulge, around the assistant driver's position, up to the engine feed line. Every 12 inches, he mounted a steel bracket, drilling holes in the floor using a hand-crank drill press that weighed 40 pounds and had been manufactured in 1917 during the previous war and rebuilt 17 times since then. The drill bit shrieked through the armor plate, throwing sparks and metal shavings, the sound echoing inside the tank loud enough that Webb's ears rang even through the cotton wadding he'd stuffed in them for hearing protection. Each hole took 3 minutes to drill through the floor's half-inch armor plate. 30 brackets meant 60 holes meant 180 minutes of drilling. 3 hours of repetitive motion that left his arms shaking and his shoulders burning. He bolted each bracket in place using 2 8mm bolts per bracket, tightening them with a socket wrench until the steel bit into the armor plate hard enough to resist vibration. Then he clamped the copper tubing into the brackets using U-bolts that wouldn't slip or loosen even when the tank hit rough terrain at speed. Where the tubing needed to rise from the floor to connect with the engine feed line, he fabricated a reinforced section using doubled tubing and extra brackets that would absorb impact from penetrating rounds. The connections required careful welding, copper to steel fittings using brass brazing rod, heating the joint to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit with an acetylene torch, applying the brazing rod until it flowed into the gap and solidified in a joint stronger than the parent metals. Each connection took 15 minutes, 8 connections, 2 hours of welding by flashlight in a cramped space where one mistake could mean a fuel leak and one fuel leak during combat could mean 5 dead crew members. By Aero 300 hours on June 19th, the modification was complete. Webb tested the fuel flow by starting the engine and checking for leaks at every connection point, every bracket, every weld. No leaks. Pressure gauge showed normal fuel pressure, 8 pounds per square inch at idle, 12 at full throttle. Flow rate was actually better than the original aluminum line because the larger copper diameter reduced restriction. Engine ran smoothly at all throttle positions. No hesitation, no surging, no indication of fuel starvation. The modification worked mechanically. Now, it needed to work in combat. Lieutenant Holloway took Iron Duke into combat at 0630 on June 19th, supporting an infantry advance toward the village of St. Lo, where German forces had established defensive positions in buildings that overlooked the approach roads. At 0734, Iron Duke took indirect fire from German artillery, 105 mm shells landing 50 yards away, close enough to shower the tank with fragments, but not close enough to penetrate. At Aero 8112, they engaged a German machine gun position, destroying it with 3 75 mm high explosive rounds. At Aero 847, while advancing through a hedgerow gap, Iron Duke took a direct hit from a German PaK-40 anti-tank gun, firing from a concealed position 400 yards north. Webb was standing 60 yards away, watching through binoculars that Captain Miller had loaned him specifically for this test. He saw the muzzle flash, saw the smoke puff, saw the round streak across the distance, too fast to follow with eyes, just a blur of motion and trajectory. Heard the impact. That sound, clang, metal on metal, the sound of physics meeting armor, the sound that preceded crew deaths in 89 previous cases. The 75mm armor-piercing round struck Iron Duke's left hull side, exactly where the fuel line had been positioned before Webb's modification. Webb held his breath. This was the moment. This was the test. Either the copper tubing along the floor would survive intact, or it would rupture and spray gasoline, and Lieutenant Holloway and his crew would have exactly 8 seconds to bail out before they burned to death. 1 Mississippi. He counted in his head, waiting for the flash of ignition, the explosion of fuel, the screams on the radio that would mean 5 more men dying in fire. 2 Mississippi. The round traveled through Iron Duke's crew compartment at 2,700 feet per second, passed 2 feet above the rerouted fuel line, passed through the space where 3 crew members were sitting, exited through the right side hull with another metallic clang. 3 Mississippi. No flash, no fire, no explosion, no screaming. 4 Mississippi. Iron Duke's engine kept running. The tank kept moving forward. The crew kept fighting. 5 Mississippi. Webb exhaled. His hands were shaking. His legs felt weak. The copper tubing had survived. The floor routing had worked. The modification had just taken a direct hit that would have killed the crew in the original configuration, and they were still alive, still fighting, still operational. 6 Mississippi. Iron Duke's turret traversed. The 75mm gun elevated. Holloway had acquired the German anti-tank gun through his scope. 7 Mississippi. Iron Duke fired. The 75mm gun recoiled, the muzzle blast throwing smoke and flame. The high explosive round crossed 400 yards in 1.2 seconds and detonated on the German position, with a flash visible even in daylight. 8 Mississippi. The German anti-tank gun was silent, destroyed. The crew either dead or running. Iron Duke survived. 5 crew members who should have burned to death were still alive. They took damage. The penetrating round knocked out the intercom system and damaged some electrical wiring. But the engine continued running. The fuel flowed normally. The tank remained combat effective. When Holloway returned to base at 17:30 that evening and reported that his tank had taken a penetrating hit in the fuel line area without burning, every tank commander in the battalion wanted to know how that was possible. Webb showed them the copper tubing and the 8-cent bolts and the steel brackets that had deflected enough impact energy to prevent rupture. By 2100 hours on June 19th, every tank commander in the 743rd Tank Battalion had requested the modification. Captain Miller authorized immediate fleet-wide implementation. By midnight, Webb and 4 additional welders were working on tank number 2. By dawn on June 20th, they'd completed 6. By noon, 11. The modification was spreading through the battalion like wildfire, and every crew that got it felt like they'd just been given a chance to survive instead of a guarantee to burn. But there were still 62 operational Shermans that needed modification, and the battalion's next major offensive was scheduled for June 25th, 6 days away. Webb did the math: 62 tanks, 6 hours per modification, 372 hours of work. If he worked 24 hours a day, he couldn't finish in time. He needed help. He needed more welders, more materials, more time. And he needed to not sleep, not eat, not stop working until every Sherman had the modification. Because somewhere out there, tank crews were climbing into unmodified Shermans, and if they took a hit in the fuel line area, they would burn to death, and Webb would know he could have saved them if he'd just worked faster. He looked at his hands, covered in grease and welding burns and rope burns from handling copper tubing and cuts from sharp metal edges, and went back to work. Because somewhere in the Norman hedgerows, 5 men were alive in Iron Duke who should have burned to death, and that meant the modification worked, and that meant every hour Webb wasted was another hour. Some other crew didn't have protection, and he wasn't going to let anyone else burn if he could help it. The German counterattack hit at 0430 hours on June 21st. Webb was underneath Sherman number 17, installing copper tubing by flashlight, when he heard the whistle. That sound, high-pitched shriek, incoming artillery, falling toward him, getting louder. He had approximately 2 seconds to decide whether he was going to live or die. Webb rolled out from under Sherman number 17 and hit the drainage ditch 30 feet north, with his hands over his head and his face pressed into mud that tasted like diesel and old blood. The first German artillery shell landed exactly where he'd been working 3 seconds earlier. The explosion threw Sherman number 17 sideways, hard enough to rock it on its suspension, spraying dirt and shrapnel across the maintenance area in a fan pattern that would have killed Webb instantly if he'd stayed under the tank trying to finish installing copper tubing. Metal fragments pinged off the Sherman's hull, with sounds like hail hitting a tin roof. The concussion wave slammed into Webb's body hard enough to drive the air from his lungs and make his ears ring with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Then the second shell hit. Then the third. Then a dozen more, walking across the maintenance area in a line of fire and explosions designed to kill anyone stupid enough to be working at 0430 in the morning when Germans launched surprise counterattacks. Webb pressed himself into the mud at the bottom of the drainage ditch and realized with cold, absolute clarity that if the Germans hit any of the modified Shermans before he finished the installations, his 8-cent bolt modification would die with him, and another 300 tank crews would burn alive in the coming weeks because he hadn't worked fast enough. The artillery barrage lasted 8 minutes, 43 shells in 480 seconds, ranging from 105 mm to 150 mm, impacting across a 200-yard front that included the maintenance area, the battalion motor pool, and part of the forward infantry positions. When the shelling stopped, Webb climbed out of the drainage ditch and counted the damage. Sherman number 17, the one he'd been working under, had taken fragment damage to the engine deck, but was otherwise intact. Sherman number 12 had taken a direct hit that blew the turret clean off. Sherman number 9 was burning. 3 maintenance trucks destroyed, 4 welders dead or wounded, including Private Jensen, who'd been helping Webb rig fuel lines and whose body Webb found 40 feet from where he'd been working, killed by a shell fragment that had passed through his chest so cleanly there was barely any blood. Captain Miller found Webb standing in the ruins of the maintenance area, covered in mud, bleeding from a dozen minor cuts where shell fragments had grazed him. "Sergeant, you alive?" "Yes, sir. Jensen's dead. We lost Sherman 9 and 12. 17 took damage but is repairable." Webb's voice sounded flat and mechanical, shock setting in, adrenaline wearing off. "How many tanks still need modification?" Miller stared at him. "We just got hit by a German artillery barrage. 4 men are dead. You're asking about fuel line modifications?" 62 tanks needed it yesterday, sir. I completed 17 by 04:30. That leaves 45 that will burn if they take hits in the fuel line area. Every hour I waste being dead or in shock is an hour those crews don't have protection. Webb picked up his toolkit from where it had been blown 20 feet by the blast. "With respect, sir, I need more welders, and I need them now. The battalion offensive is scheduled for June 25th. That's 4 days. I need to complete 45 modifications in 96 hours." Miller made the decision that saved 73 Sherman crews over the next 11 days. "You'll have every welder in the division. I'm pulling men from other battalions. You'll work in shifts. 8 hours on, 4 hours off. Rotate crews to maintain efficiency. And I'm assigning you a security detail, because if you get killed by artillery, we lose the only person who knows how to install this modification." He paused. "Also, you're being recommended for a Silver Star. You just saved 17 tank crews. If you save 45 more, it'll be a Distinguished Service Cross." Webb didn't care about medals. He cared about the 45 Sherman tanks that still had aluminum fuel lines positioned 14 inches from the hull side in the kill zone. He went back to work. By 0800 hours on June 21st, Webb had 8 welders working under his supervision, installing copper fuel lines and steel brackets and 8-cent bolts in a production line that would have made Henry Ford proud. Tank enters Bay 1, gets stripped of aluminum fuel line. Tank moves to Bay 2, gets copper tubing routed along floor. Tank moves to Bay 3, gets brackets installed and welded. Tank moves to Bay 4, gets tested for leaks and fuel flow. Total time per tank, 4 hours with an 8-man crew working in parallel. By noon on June 21st, they'd completed 8 more tanks, total 25 modified, 37 remaining. By 1800 hours, 12 more, total 37 modified, 25 remaining. By midnight, 8 more, total 45 modified, 17 remaining. Webb worked 22-hour shifts for the next 3 days. Sleep became something he did for 90 minutes at a time while other welders continued the work. Food became whatever someone shoved in his hands between installations. His hands, already damaged from welding burns and cuts, started bleeding again from repetitive drilling and bolting. The skin on his palms cracked and split. He wrapped them in electrical tape and kept working because stopping meant tank crews would die. And he'd already watched 5 men burn in Kansas Bell, and he wasn't going to let that happen to anyone else if he could help it. The battalion's offensive launched on June 25th at 0600 hours. 62 Sherman tanks, all equipped with Webb's modification, advanced toward German positions near St. Lo. The battle lasted 11 days. In that time, 73 Sherman tanks took penetrating hits in the fuel line area, the section of hull where Kansas Belle had been hit, where Tommy Richardson had died halfway out the hatch, where the aluminum fuel line used to run 14 inches from the hull side. Of those 73 hits, exactly 0 resulted in fuel fires. 0 crews burned to death. 365 tank crew members, who statistically should have died in fires, survived because copper tubing along the floor didn't rupture when German rounds passed 2 feet above it. The first confirmation came on June 26th. Sherman, Thunder Ridge, took a direct hit from a German PaK-40 at Arrow 847 hours. The 75mm armor-piercing round punched through the left hull side exactly where the fuel line had been positioned before Webb's modification. The round passed through the crew compartment, missed the driver by 8 inches, exited through the right side. The copper fuel line along the floor survived intact. No rupture, no fire, no casualties. Thunder Ridge withdrew for repairs, returned to combat 6 hours later with a welded patch over the entry and exit holes. The second confirmation came on June 27th. Sherman, Liberty Belle, took 2 hits in the same engagement, one at 10:32 hours, one at 10:47 hours. Both rounds struck the left hull side within 2 feet of each other. Both passed through the area where the aluminum fuel line used to run. The copper tubing survived both hits. The crew suffered 1 casualty. The assistant driver took fragments from the second round and lost 3 fingers on his left hand. But all 5 crew members survived, and Liberty Belle remained combat effective. By June 30th, modified Sherman tanks in the 743rd Tank Battalion had taken 31 penetrating hits in fuel line areas with 0 fires. By July 5th, 57 hits, 0 fires. By July 10th, 73 hits, 0 fires. The statistics were so dramatic, so undeniable, that battalion commanders from other units started requesting Webb's modification for their tanks. Captain Miller forwarded the request to division headquarters with a note. Sergeant Webb's field modification has eliminated fuel fires in 73 penetrating hits. Recommend immediate fleet-wide adoption. But division headquarters had to contend with the Army's Ordnance Department, which did not appreciate unauthorized field modifications to standardized equipment. On July 12th, a colonel from Ordnance arrived at the 743rd Tank Battalion to inspect Webb's modification and determine whether it violated regulations, compromised combat effectiveness, or created liability issues that would require court-martial proceedings. Colonel Richard Hastings was 46 years old, West Point class of 1921, career ordnance officer who'd spent 23 years writing equipment specifications and enforcing manufacturing standards. He'd never seen combat, never worked in a maintenance depot, never been inside a Sherman tank during combat operations. He'd spent the war in offices at Aberdeen Proving Ground and Pentagon committees, and he arrived in Normandy convinced that field modifications were dangerous improvisations that undermined standardization and created supply chain nightmares. He inspected Webb's copper tubing and 8-cent bolts and steel brackets with the expression of someone examining a dead animal found under a porch. Sergeant, this modification violates at least 6 technical orders regarding fuel system specifications. The copper tubing is non-standard. The brackets are fabricated from salvaged materials. The mounting bolts are German manufacture. He made notes on a clipboard. I'm recommending that this modification be removed from all vehicles and that you face disciplinary action for unauthorized modifications to military equipment. Captain Miller, standing beside Webb, interrupted. Colonel, this modification has saved 73 tank crews from fuel fires. 0 fires in 73 penetrating hits. Those are men who would have burned to death without this modification. Statistics are irrelevant if the modification violates specifications, Hastings said. Military equipment must be standardized. Field modifications create maintenance nightmares, supply chain complications, and liability issues. If every sergeant decided to modify equipment based on their personal theories, we'd have chaos. Webb, who'd been standing silently with his bleeding hands behind his back, spoke for the first time. "Colonel, with respect, I've pulled 14 burned bodies from Sherman tanks in the past month. I've scraped carbonized remains off surfaces. I've carried men in buckets because there wasn't enough left to put in coffins. The aluminum fuel lines are killing Americans faster than Germans are. My modification stops that. If specifications are more important than lives, then court-martial me. But don't you dare tell me statistics are irrelevant." Hastings stared at Webb, his face reddening. "Sergeant, you're addressing a superior officer. I could have you in the stockade for insubordination." "Then do it, sir. Because I'm not removing these modifications, and I'm not letting any more tank crews burn if I can prevent it." Webb's voice was quiet but absolute. "You can court-martial me. You can throw me in the stockade. But before you do, ride in a Sherman during combat. Take a hit in the fuel line area. Feel what it's like to smell gasoline spraying across the engine compartment, and know you have 8 seconds to get out before you burn alive. Then tell me specifications matter more than lives." The standoff lasted 5 seconds. Then Lieutenant Holloway, commander of Iron Duke, stepped forward. "Colonel, I'm the tank commander who tested Sergeant Webb's modification. On June 19th, my tank took a penetrating hit in the fuel line area. If we'd had the original aluminum line, my crew would have burned to death. Instead, we survived, killed the German anti-tank gun, and returned to base for repairs. My crew is alive because of Sergeant Webb. Every crew member in this battalion is alive because of him. If you want to court-martial him for saving American lives, you'll have to go through me first." Then Sergeant Jackson stepped forward. "I'm Jackson, gunner on Thunder Ridge. We took a hit on June 26th. Should have burned. Didn't. Crew survived." Then Private Ramirez. "Ramirez, driver on Liberty Bell. We took 2 hits. Should have burned twice. Survived both times." Then 12 more tank crew members, one after another, stepping forward and stating their names and their tank assignments, and the fact that they were alive because of Webb's modification. 23 men in total, all standing in a line, all willing to face court-martial before they'd let Webb be punished for saving their lives. Colonel Hastings looked at the line of tank crew members, looked at Webb's bleeding hands, looked at his clipboard full of technical violations. He made the decision that would change U.S. Army tank design for the next 40 years. "The modification is approved for fleet-wide adoption. I'll draft new technical specifications. You'll receive proper credit." He looked at Webb. "And Sergeant, you're right. Specifications don't matter more than lives. I apologize." The modification spread through the 3rd Armored Division like wildfire. By July 20th, every operational Sherman in the division had Webb's copper fuel line system. By August 1st, the modification had reached other divisions in Normandy. By September, Army Ordnance had drafted formal specifications based on Webb's design, designated it Field Modification Package FMP 4407, and authorized implementation across all M4 Sherman tanks in the European theater. By October, factory-built Shermans were rolling off assembly lines in Detroit, with copper fuel lines already installed along the floor in the configuration Webb had invented in a Norman salvage yard using parts from destroyed German vehicles. The impact was measurable and dramatic. Before Webb's modification, approximately 70% of Sherman tanks that took penetrating hits in the fuel line area burned within 10 seconds, killing an average of 3.2 crew members per fire. After the modification, fuel fire rates dropped to less than 5% in the same hit locations, and crew survival rates improved by 68%. Between July and December 1944, an estimated 365 American tank crew members survived combat engagements that would have killed them in unmodified Shermans. The modification didn't make Sherman tanks invincible, They still burned when hit in other areas, still suffered casualties from penetrating rounds, still faced superior German armor in one-on-one engagements, but it eliminated the single most deadly vulnerability that had killed more American tankers than enemy fire. German tank crews noticed the change. Intercepted radio communications from July 1944 included reports that American Shermans are no longer burning after penetrating hits, and the Tommy cooker has stopped cooking. German intelligence analyzed destroyed Shermans and discovered Webb's copper fuel line system, documented it in tactical reports, warned their anti-tank gun crews that targeting the hull sides was less effective than before. But by the time the Germans figured out what had changed, the modification was already fleet-wide, and the mathematics of tank combat had permanently shifted in favor of the Allies. Webb worked through the rest of the Normandy campaign, then the liberation of France, then the push into Germany. He modified 247 Sherman tanks personally. He trained 63 other welders in the technique. He never stopped thinking about the 5 men who burned in Kansas Bell, about Tommy Richardson halfway out the hatch, about Private Daniel screaming in the medical tent. The memories didn't fade. They became part of him, permanent scars that shaped every decision he made for the rest of his life. He received the Silver Star on August 15, 1944, in a ceremony at division headquarters. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious service in the performance of outstanding services, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, through his initiative, technical skill, and devotion to duty, developed and implemented a field modification that significantly enhanced the survivability of M4 Sherman tanks and directly resulted in saving the lives of numerous American servicemen." His actions reflect the highest credit upon himself and the United States Army. General Omar Bradley personally pinned the medal on Webb's uniform and said 8 words Webb never forgot: "You saved more lives than most generals." The war ended in May 1945. Webb returned to Detroit in September, discharged with the rank of Technical Sergeant, a Silver Star, a combat infantry badge despite never serving in infantry units, and hands that bore permanent scars from welding burns and drill presses and copper tubing that cut through electrical tape and skin. Ford rehired him at the River Rouge plant at $140 an hour, 20 cents more than his pre-war wage, and he spent the next 34 years welding automotive frames on the same assembly lines where he'd learned the trade as a teenager. He married in 1947, a woman named Dorothy who worked in the Ford accounting department and who never fully understood why her husband sometimes woke up screaming about fires. They had 3 children, none of whom went into welding or joined the military. Webb lived quietly, never talked about the war except when other veterans asked specific questions, never mentioned that his field modification had saved 365 lives and changed how the Army designed tanks. When the local VFW asked him to speak at Memorial Day ceremonies, he declined. "I just welded some tubing," he'd say. Other men did the fighting. In 1979, a military historian researching Sherman tank modifications found Webb's name in Army archives and tracked him down in Detroit. The historian, Dr. Stephen Zaloga, wanted to interview Webb about the copper fuel line system for a book about American armored warfare. Webb initially refused. It was just an 8-cent bolt modification, not worth writing about. But Zaloga persisted, and eventually Webb agreed to one interview in his living room, sitting in a chair with photographs of his children on the walls and his Silver Star in a drawer somewhere upstairs where nobody had to look at it. "Why did you create the modification?" Zaloga asked. "Because 5 men burned to death while I watched," Webb said. "One of them almost made it out. 10 more seconds and he'd have survived. That seemed like something worth fixing." "Did you know it would save hundreds of lives?" "I knew it would save the next crew that took a hit. That seemed like enough." "Do you consider yourself a hero?" Webb was silent for a long moment. Heroes are the men who climbed into those tanks knowing they might burn. I just welded some copper tubing. They're the ones who deserve to be remembered. Marcus Webb died on March 14, 1989, at age 73, from emphysema, probably from decades of welding fumes, though the doctors couldn't say for certain. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his 34 years at Ford, his 3 children, his Silver Star from World War II. It didn't mention the 365 tank crew members who came home alive because he'd figured out how to reroute a fuel line. It didn't mention Tommy Richardson or Kansas Bell, or the fact that an 8-cent bolt modification had changed the outcome of armored warfare in Europe. But on March 14, 2019, the 30th anniversary of Webb's death, the U.S. Army Tank Automotive Command held a ceremony at the Detroit Arsenal to honor his contribution to armored vehicle design. 17 surviving Sherman tank crew members attended, all of them in their 90s. All of them alive because Webb's modification had prevented fires in tanks they'd served in. They unveiled a plaque that read, "In memory of Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb, 1916-1989. His field modification to M4 Sherman fuel systems saved an estimated 365 American lives during World War II and influenced armored vehicle design for 4 decades. I just welded some copper tubing." One of the surviving crew members, Lieutenant James Holloway, retired, age 99, gave a short speech. "I was the tank commander who tested Sergeant Webb's modification in combat. On June 19, 1944, my tank took a hit that should have killed us. We survived. My crew survived. I went home to my wife and had 4 children and 11 grandchildren and got to live 75 years longer than I should have. All because a welder from Detroit figured out that copper tubing along the floor doesn't rupture as easily as aluminum tubing near the engine. He saved my life. He saved 364 other lives. He changed the war. And all he ever said about it was, 'I just welded some copper tubing.' That's the kind of hero America needs to remember." The modification itself remained in use longer than the Sherman tank. The principle of routing fuel lines along protected paths away from high-temperature zones and likely impact areas became standard practice in the design of the M26 Pershing, the M46 Patton, the M47, M48, M60, and eventually the M1 Abrams. Modern tank fuel systems still incorporate variants of Webb's original concept: protected routing, impact-resistant materials, thermal isolation from engine compartments. The 8-cent bolts are now $4 aerospace-grade fasteners. The copper tubing is now titanium-reinforced composite lines. The steel brackets are now aramid fiber shielding. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Keep fuel away from places where it can ignite, and more crews survive. In 2024, the Smithsonian National Museum of American History acquired one of the original copper fuel line assemblies from a Sherman tank that had been modified by Webb in July 1944. The tank, serial number 30588441, had served with the 3rd Armored Division through France and Germany, had taken 4 penetrating hits without burning, had survived the war intact and been decommissioned in 1946. The fuel line assembly, 40 feet of copper tubing, 30 steel brackets, 60 German-made 8mm bolts, was removed during restoration and donated to the museum. It now sits in a display case with a placard explaining its significance. Visitors walk past it daily. Most don't stop to read the placard. Those who do learn about a welder from Detroit who watched 5 men burn in a tank and decided that was unacceptable, who spent 3 nights in a salvage yard building a modification from copper tubing and 8-cent bolts, who saved 365 lives and changed how armies design armored vehicles. The copper tubing is corroded now, green with age, bent in places from 80 years of storage. The bolts are rusty, the brackets are pitted, but they're real, actual components that prevented fuel fires, that kept gasoline away from engine heat, that gave 365 tank crews the chance to go home to their families instead of dying in fires at age 19, 23, 24, 28. And in a filing cabinet in the museum's archives, stored in acid-free folders, are copies of 365 letters that families never had to receive. Letters that would have started with, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, husband, brother was killed in action on," letters that were never written because Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb looked at an aluminum fuel line positioned 14 inches from the hull side and thought, "That's going to kill someone," and decided to fix it. Sometimes the most important innovations aren't complex. Sometimes they're just copper tubing and 8-cent bolts installed by a welder who couldn't stop seeing 5 men burn, and who decided that if he could prevent even one more crew from dying the same way, it would be worth spending 3 nights in a salvage yard and risking court-martial for unauthorized field modifications. Sometimes heroes don't think they're heroes. They just think they're welders doing a job that needs doing. And sometimes those welders save 365 lives and change history, one 8-cent bolt at a time.